So my son's been wanting a desk in his bedroom for a while now, so we decided to build him one and give it to him as a Christmas gift. So I immediately hopped on SketchUp and started a design. I wanted it to be something that wouldn't take up too much space in his bedroom, but still had enough workspace for him so that he could read books or do his homework on it. I also wanted it to have some shelves that he could put things on like books or his small knickknacks. And lastly, I wanted to incorporate some RGB LED lighting to make it fun for him. Now after generating my cut list, I headed off to my local big box store for the lumber and picked up two 10-foot 2x6s, two 8-foot 2x4s, one 8-foot 1x6, and one 3-foot 1x4. I also picked up some extra materials for the build, like some pocket screws and pocket hole plugs, a 36-inch strip of 3/4 inch wide 12-gauge steel, and a 1/8 inch thick hardboard handy panel that measured 2x4 feet. The first thing that I decided to work on was the desk surface, which is basically a glue up of 2x6s. Since I'm planing them down to 1 1/4 inches thick, I'm rough cutting them 6 inches longer than the final width to account for planer snipe at the ends of the boards. Now before I start milling my wood, I make sure that the fence is square. I start by jointing the faces so that I have a flat surface to start with. Then I put the flat surface against my joiner fence and joint one of the edges. Now the whole thought process behind this is that you get yourself one of the edges and faces square to each other, thus surfacing two sides of the lumber. After jointing the board comes the thickness planer. This part of the milling process is that you are making the untouched face of the board parallel to that jointed face, while planing to the desired thickness at the same time. At this point, you have three sides of the lumber surfaced. Making sure the blade is square to the table, I use the table saw to surface the last edge of the board. At this point, you'll have all the faces and edges square to each other and surfaced, or S4S lumber. Now we lay out the boards for the glue up. They say that you want to alternate the end grain direction of the boards to avoid any cupping of the entire panel once it's all glued up, but I forgot to do that here, and to be honest with you, I don't do that many glue ups, so I can't tell you from experience, and in this case, I'll cross my fingers that we have no issues down the road. Now for one last pass on the jointer. Here I'm marking each edge in and out. If the edge has an I joint the edge with the face facing inwards or towards the fence, and if the edge has an O, I joint the edge with the face facing outwards or away from the fence. This is done just in case my joiner fence isn't exactly square and will avoid any compounding errors along the entire glue up of the edges. So everything was going great and then this happened. Turns out I had a chip in my joiner blade. Unfortunately, I don't have time to wait for a new blade to arrive, so I'll sand it down a little later and it's pretty much full send from here on out. Hey, nothing's perfect and I'm no expert woodworker, but I have gotten pretty good at fixing my mistakes over the years. Now comes the glue up. Pretty easy. Basically, I load up the edges with glue and clamp the boards together. I'm putting tape on these small pieces of wood since I'll be clamping them to the tops to help line everything up. They're going to prevent the glue squeeze out from gluing them to the desktop. And you want to know how I learned that little trick? Well, don't ask. Now I have to actually do these glue ups separately because my planer is 13 inches, so I have to send each half through the planer to the desired thickness once they're glued up. After that, then I'll do one final glue up of the two halves. While the glue ups were drying, I decided to start working on the lower base. Like with the desktop, I start by milling the wood. First jointing the face, then jointing the edges, and then running them through the planer to their final thicknesses. Before I surface the last edges with the table saw, I'm going to cut all the boards down to size them on the miter saw. I'm going to start with the four legs. They measure 28 inches, and since they'll be ripped down to 3 inches, we'll use the 2x4s. I'll set a stop block so that I can make repeatable cuts, making my legs all the same exact length. Next, I'll cut the front and rear aprons to size. They both measure 25 inches in length, and with the front being 2.5 inches wide, we'll use the 2x4. With the rear measuring 4.5 inches wide, we'll use a 2x6. Lastly, we'll cut the two side aprons and two leg stretchers to size. They all measure 17.25 inches in length, and with the aprons being 4.5 inches wide, we'll use a 2x6. With the stretchers being 3 inches wide, we'll use a 2x4. Now we're ready to surface those last edges and rip all of the boards for the base down to their final widths. We'll start off with the rear and two side aprons, since they all measure 4.5 inches wide. Next, we'll rip down all four legs and the two stretchers since they all measure 3 inches wide. And finally, we'll rip down the front apron. What I find helps when drilling a lot of pocket holes is to mark out where you want all of them first. It makes the process go so much quicker when drilling them. And before you use the pocket hole jig, you need to set the drill stop and guide to correct measurements. I'm joining 1 1/4 inch boards, so I'll need to set them both at 1 1/4 inches each. Now it's time to go spend time with my family, so that's going to be a wrap for day one. So today we're going to finish the glue up, now that the glue had a chance to dry overnight. We'll start by running both sides through the planer to the final thickness of 1 1/4 inch. After that, we'll finish the glue up by joining both halves together and let them cure overnight. And of course, I forgot to use my paper on the assembly table, so now I get to spend the time that I don't have wiping up the glue from the squeeze out. Next, I decided to work on the top shelf assembly. It's a simple design with 4 small cubby holes and 1 large cubby hole off to the side. And I'm not going to mill down the wood here because I'm using 1-bys, and if I milled those down, there wouldn't be much wood left to work with. I started off by setting my stop block at 31.5 inches and cutting down the boards for the top and the top front trim. Next, I'll cut the 2 side boards and the 2 vertical dividers. I set the stop block at 10 3/4 inch for all 4 boards. Then lastly, I cut the 2 horizontal middle shelves. For these 2 boards, I set the stop block at 9 1/16 inch. After all the boards were cut to size, I headed over to the table saw to rip them all down to width. First, I'll slightly clean up the rear edges of the top and 2 vertical sideboards since they will all need to be the same width. Then, I'll rip down the 2 vertical dividers and the 2 horizontal shelves to 4 3/4 inch. Lastly, I'll rip down the front upper trim to 1 inch. Now moving back to the lower base that I started yesterday, I sanded all the boards starting at 80 grit and then ending it with 150 grit. Assembling the sides consists of the 4 legs, 2 upper side aprons, and 2 lower leg stretchers. I start with the 2 legs and stretcher, placing a 3/4 inch spacer board on the table for the stretcher to rest on since the stretchers are recessed towards the center of the legs. Then with my combination square set to 6 inches, I make sure both ends of the stretcher are aligned and clamp them in place. And per the Craig guide, I'll be using 2-inch screws to join the 2 1 1/4 inch boards together. Next, I'll join the upper side aprons, again using the 3/4 inch board on the table as a spacer for the inset. And like before, I'll be using glue and 2-inch screws to join. And the other side is pretty much just rinse and repeat. Now it's time to join the 2 sides of the base together. I'll glue and screw the front and rear aprons to both leg assemblies, making sure that the tops are all flush with each other, then clamping everything down. Next, I decided to work on the upper shelf assembly. I start by drilling all the holes for the pocket screws. After drilling all the pocket holes, I give the boards a quick sanding starting with 80 grit and working my way up to 150 grit. I'm going to start off with attaching the right side since it'll be used as a reference to set the spacing for the 2 vertical divider boards. And I'll use the 2 horizontal shelves as the spacers for reference when gluing and screwing both vertical dividers. Now that the pocket hole plugs are cured, I can proceed with the assembly of the top shelf. I won't be installing the middle shelf boards just yet because I need access to flush cut the pocket hole plugs that I installed earlier. And a little trick that I learned from Brad over there at Fix This Build That. Playing cards or something similar works great for flush cutting because it will avoid you tearing up the wood that you're flushing up against. Now it's time to install the middle shelves. I cut 2 spacer blocks for reference so that the shelves will be perfectly centered and spaced from the top. Now these I won't be joining with pocket screws, simply because there wasn't enough access to fit my drill in the opening, so I'll be gluing and brad nailing the shelves together. I decided to mark a center line so that I don't miss the shelves when nailing them together. Next, we'll install the upper trim. The purpose of this trim is to create a small overhang to conceal the LED light strip, and I'll just be gluing and brad nailing this on. And that's pretty much going to be it for day 3 because I have some family things to attend to, but before I shut it down for the day, I'm going to sand the desktop surface starting with 80 grit and then finishing off with 150 grit. Now it's time to attach the top shelf assembly to the desktop. I'm marking the outline of the shelf mating points so that I can pre-drill holes for the installation. I'm also marking the outer edges to use as a guideline to set the width of the desktop. And I made some changes here to the original plan and added about 1/4 inch to each side to give a slight reveal between the desktop and the upper shelf assembly. Next, I use my square to mark cut lines and use a track to make my cuts. I'm using this Craig AccuCut, which is a cheap alternative to using a track saw because you can use your existing circular saw with the saw attachment provided by Craig. Before I mount the upper shelf assembly to the desk, I pre-drill my holes according to the mounting marks that I made earlier. I also decided to use an 1/8 inch roundover bit to soften all of the edges before I put everything together. Lastly, I do a little more sanding before final assembly. Now I can take the top shelf assembly, line it up with the marks that I made earlier, and clamp everything down securely before screwing. I chose not to glue it to the top of the desktop, just in case someday we want to take it off to transport it. I'll pre-drill the holes into the top shelf using the existing pre-drilled holes in the desktop, and then finish off with a countersink bit so that the screws are recessed. Now I can mount the desk base to the desktop, and to be honest, I probably should have used glue with these screws, but I was so excited to get it together that it slipped my mind. Next, I used my combination square to set the depths of the overhang, and then attach it all together with pocket screws. After everything is assembled, I do a final sand with 220 grit. Now I proceed to make the corner brackets. Sure, I could have bought them, but what's the fun in that? Instead, I bought a strip of 3/4 inch wide 12 gauge steel that I'm going to make my own out of. I start off by scribing every 6 inches to cut 4 6-inch strips. Next, I mount the strip in the vise, and with a cutoff wheel, I cut up my scribe marks. After that, I move to the bench grinder and round off the sharp edges where I made the cuts. Next, I scribe a center line on each bracket for the bends, and for the mounting holes, I start by using a punch to mark 1 inch from the edge, and then take it over to the drill press to drill the holes. After cleaning up the burrs from drilling the holes, I move over to the vise to make the 90-degree bend for the brackets. I'll line up the scribe mark in the vise, making sure that the bracket is square to the vise, and then start hammering near the center of the bracket to create the 90-degree bend. Next, I'll sand and prep the brackets for paint, and then use an all-in-one primer and paint to refinish the brackets with a total of 4 coats. Now before I put on the stain, I put down some pre-stain. This is important, especially when staining a softwood like pine, because it'll help avoid blotchiness after the stain dries. After about 15 minutes, I wipe off any residue from the pre-stain and then lay down the stain. I decided to go with ebony black, which on pine will give it a nice dark brown color. Now that the stain is dried overnight, I can put on the polyurethane. Before applying the poly, I make sure to take a tack cloth and wipe off the panel to get rid of any dust. Now I'm going to be periodically putting on coats of poly throughout the day, since the recoat time is every 4 hours, and making sure to lightly sand with 220 grit sandpaper between coats. And I'm going to be putting on 3 coats in total. Well, today is Christmas Eve now, we're in the home stretch, and I have a few things left to do. Now that the poly is cured, I can install the corner brackets. I'll use a self-centering drill bit to drill the holes, and then install the screws by hand instead of using my impact to avoid stripping them out. Next, I need to install the LED lights. Now this set is nice because not only was it inexpensive, but it operates on 2 AA batteries. To attach the switch in the power box, I used some double-sided tape, and the light strip comes with an adhesive backside, which made installation very easy. The last piece of the build is making the backboard for the upper shelf assembly. I'm going with 1/8 inch hardboard for this. I measure and mark out the dimensions for the board, rip it down the width with the table saw, and cut it to length on the miter saw. And of course, I cut the side with the label on it, so now I get to take the time to peel that off. And to finish off the build, I'll attach it with some small trim nails.
Holy smokes!
He's gonna figure it out.
A desk! What?
Isn't that cool?
What? Thanks, Dad!
Now what's your favorite gift?
Now.
I love you, buddy. See, that's why you got a chair.